Welcome to It Takes Two Takes. My name is Adam. This is Andrew. In this video, we're going to talk about the new movie that came out from Netflix, The Old Guard, starring KiKi Layne and Charlize Theron. And this movie is more of a summer action movie, direct to streaming. The trailer looked interesting. Different premise, a little bit fantasy, a little bit action war type movie. And we'll start off with some non-spoiler thoughts, and at some point we will let you know when we get into spoiler territory, so if you have not seen it and you don't like spoilers, you can switch off and come back after you've seen the movie. But initial thoughts. Andrew, what did you think of this movie?
So, of course, without any spoilers, I will say it was solid. There was a lot of room for improvement, and if they choose to make any subsequent stories based off of this particular film, without again any spoilers, I'm interested. So they've got me at least for that. But overall, I think it's a really cool concept, right? I mean, it's full of this so much potential for like this lore, which they do tap into. This concept of sort of these mercenaries, and to say that they're immortal isn't really as detailed as maybe it could be, in the sense that if you've seen the trailer, you kind of realize these are characters that they die and they just almost wake up like it never happened, and they heal, Wolverine style, and they ultimately can live for a very, very, very long time. But it doesn't always work out that way for some people, as they tell with certain backstories of certain characters. But overall, look, the concept was cool. I think there were certain areas that could have been executed a bit better.
So yeah, basically the plot, and it kind of gives us away in the trailer, is the idea that there are this group of people that do not age, they do not die. If you shoot them, they'll heal. And they've been going around fighting for a very long time in numerous types of campaigns. And they just continue to fight for the betterment of the world, as they've been doing for centuries.
Charlize Theron is sort of their leader. She's been around the longest.
So the main actress of this movie, and the main draw for this movie, is Charlize Theron. And I think this is very much a led off of her type of movie. Kind of the way, Extraction really led with, this is Chris Hemsworth led movie. I think this is very much relied a lot on, this is Charlize Theron's movie. And I enjoyed it. I think we both are going to have some little bits that we want to pick apart in this movie. Overall, I kind of like the concept.
Yeah.
I think there are areas that they could definitely have improved, and some areas they could have tweaked a little bit better. I think they could definitely make a second chapter that is stronger than the first chapter if they choose to.
For sure.
But overall,
this felt like a very long origin story, to be honest.
It did, and it set up some good characters to follow, I think. And I think they left it in some ways that make you wonder about, if they do any sequel, certain aspects of how they'll pull it off, again, without getting into spoiler territory. I think it was shot well. I don't know that it was quite the production as far as the shots. I don't know that are necessarily movie theater, like summer blockbuster movie theater quality. But at the same time, it's better quality than I think someone might expect going into a story like this from a direct to streaming service at the same time. So I think there's a good middle ground.
If we're doing kind of general overview type stuff, I will say that regarding the way it was shot, I agree with you in that there were certain ways it just almost like it almost didn't have any character the way it was shot. It was just very straightforward in terms of like the overall tone, the sort of like colors of the film. There was really none of that to pull from. It was just like very straightforward. But I will mention that I did like the fact that, I did expect to see some really cool action sequences, and there were some really good ones. I liked the sort of influence of the Muay Thai fighting and things like that were going on with Charlize Theron's character. I do appreciate anytime a film more specifically a director, is shooting action sequences and you actually know what's going on. So she did.
It was not a Jason Bourne shaky cam type of situation.
Yeah, there wasn't like 8 different cuts in like 5 seconds, kind of like Taken or something, where it was just like just constant cutting to just deliver one blow. I mean,
I think that speaks a lot to the actress as well, because if you've seen Atomic Blonde, where she did her own stunts in that and she trained hard for that, I think that really helped pave the way for her to do that type of role here as well, because she already proved that she can and she got good at it, so she could do it again. I think had she not have done that, that movie Atomic Blonde, which was it was an okay movie, but not a great movie, but it really proved her her ability to do a fight scene really well. I think that really led a lot into this movie, and really gave her the chops to do so. So I think go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, to kind of quickly, kind of from an overview standpoint, I think of this really as, yes, action film. You have somewhat of a sci-fi, obviously based on a graphic novel, so you kind of got this fantasy element. There are a lot of similarities with sort of the concept of X-Men in the sense of jaded with humanity. You're hiding your particular gift from humanity. You don't want them to find out because they'll try to find a way to screw you over and exploit it. There's a lot of that, but that's kind of establishing sort of the concept, and really, are they the sort of guardians of humanity, or are they just so fed up with humanity that they don't want to deal with it anymore? So I think that's probably a proper way to set up what you're kind of getting into with this film, with, of course, great, very well shot action sequences.
Yeah, if you like action movies, you like a little bit of fantasy aspect to it, but you also like those a lot of the more shoot 'em up war type gritty type moments, fighting moments as well, I think you'll enjoy this film. And at this point, if you have not seen the movie and you don't like spoilers, I would go ahead and stop this here, watch the movie, and come back. Now, if you don't mind spoilers or you've already seen the movie, we're going to go straight into spoiler territory at this point, so you have been warned. I think some of the characters that did a good job of giving a very human aspect to them. I think where I felt they didn't do that well was with Charlize's character of Andy.
I agree.
She came off very stiff. Like Booker, you understood his motivation. They did a really good job of setting him up on why he might be Judas, based on his situation with his kids and family and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Joe and Nikki, they did a good job of setting their dynamic up and why they are so attached to each other, and why they kind of complement each other so well. Even they did a good job with KiKi Layne's character as well, as far as bringing her in as here's the new person into the group.
Niall,
I think I think they did a good job of setting them up. I feel like the emotional weight aspect was weakest with Charlize's character. Now, there were a little bit of moments here and there you felt a little bit, but I thought those were moments that if they had just blown those up just a little bit, so you actually would give a damn about her character a little bit, it would have been better. Because that was the biggest thing I think was a weakness, is I didn't really care about her, and she's the lead.
I'm going to expand on that, because you're hitting exactly what I came into this wanting to say. Again, the lore, I feel like, is its strongest point. I enjoy that. I wanted more of that.
Yes, absolutely.
The most interesting scenes were moments of their backstory, and there weren't enough of those.
And I think that could have been a budget thing at the same time, right? And maybe with the sequel, they could do more.
Right. And before I even get into like character things I enjoy, because I want to talk about some of the pros and cons from a conflict villain standpoint. That's a whole nother story. I agree. It took way too long to convince me of, honestly, almost all of the character motivations, because in my opinion, if I can't care about these characters within 20 minutes, there's a problem. And I don't really feel like I did until, at best, early/midway through, let's say early second act, is maybe when things started to catch on, where I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool.
I think it's Booker. I think it's really Booker that you start to, when he starts to explain to Niall about the pitfalls of staying connected to your family while you don't age,
Right.
I think that's when you actually start to care about a character.
And in my opinion, that takes a while for a
Yeah.
2-hour film, like within that context, to make that happen. And get to your point, Charlize Theron, an Academy Award winning actress, she came off as obnoxiously jaded. And what I mean by that is she was so like,
There was one dimensional.
she's just, I'm like, I get it. You hate what you do. You've been around for eternity. I don't even know what that means at this point. You've not convinced me that it means anything and why I should care. And maybe it's fair or maybe it's not fair to blame her performance for this. It may be because they spend just way too much time really to get to the point of what caused her particular worldview and her overall actions.
One monologue with her when KiKi or when Niall is kind of rebelling against this idea of joining the group. One good
exactly what you're
brief monologue from her would have done it. Like her going into, you have no idea what I've seen, what I have been through, the things that you will have to go through. You need to, and just give a few, like hit a few points. Like you get a little bit. And it's not even her talking about Quinn, you know?
Yeah, it's the same bullshit that in most
it was the other characters talking about Quinn. Kid. It should have been Andy should have been the one who said, this is my failure and this is why. She should have been the one to talk about Quinn. And I felt like it would have felt more weight if we had gotten that emotional connection because she talks about Quinn, as opposed to, well, the other guys are going to tell you something that Andy obviously isn't going to bring up.
Which, by the way, not to diminish that whole thing, because in my opinion, honestly, probably I would say definitely the first moment that I was like, holy shit, this is heavy, was that moment where you actually can see the consequences of characters being caught and captured in this film. Yes. And that Quinn scene, like the way, and credit to the director, the way that it was shot of her being backed away with that cross being held up in front of her and she's screaming inside the suit of armor that's completely like emotionless, but she's inside. The thought of drowning, what they say at the time for 500 years, is horrifying. So just that, and maybe it's a credit to the concept. You drown and
you die. You drown to the point you die, and then you wake back up just to do it all over again.
I don't know. Honestly, I didn't have time to wrap my head around this. Like they could have maybe even taken what they had and just kind of reordered it. I don't want to go down that path, but my point being that I feel like there are very effective scenes in that movie and it took way too long to get to them. And when they got to them, it took way too long between other scenes that made sense. In my opinion, the last 15 minutes of that movie explained to me everyone's motivations to the point where I'm like, why did we just spend 2 hours to get here? I mean, action sequences, all that. I'm no stranger to the thrill of, a clothesline plot just to make action happen. But you wanted me so bad to care about these characters, it seemed like, and you accomplished it with a couple of scenes in the last 15 minutes of film. Because even Copley, like, I know that it was kind of not a twist, but you kind of realize like he kind of figured out things and he hated seeing his wife die.
He was the most emotional character of the whole movie, right?
But again, the last 15 minutes of film was when all of a sudden it was fully realized. It made me go, I really like this character. But I didn't know that much about how much I liked him until that moment. And why did we do that in the last 15 minutes of the film?
And there was a part, though, that made me immediately go to the Highlander TV series to a certain extent.
There's a lot of parallels with Highlander. I could see that.
Because of the fact that he's now, like, if you watch the Highlander TV series, there was a group that were called the Watchers, Mm-hmm. And now he's ultimately become that Watcher. Now he's going to clean up after them also, but at the same time, they set him up as the Watchers to the Immortals, right? So I definitely felt the parallel there.
You have a much better pickup on the parallel. Here's how my dumb brain worked. The moment I saw Copley going, like basically saying like, we're going to do this. Like it could have been anything. It could have been like a reference to Avengers. And my brain goes like, oh, he's Bosley. Like, okay, cool. I get this. I like that. Which is so dumb. I was like, oh yeah, now I see. I felt like they could have, I don't know. I get that it leads to the sequel in that sense of him coming in and being like, now he knows his place. Every character knows their place. We know where Booker's got to deal with.
And they've obviously, the movie sets itself up for a sequel. I've read that they actually have got like a whole trilogy written out. So there's, and this apparently did amazing on Netflix. So the likelihood of a sequel is almost guaranteed, I think, at this point, unless something goes completely off the deep end with the actors or something. Um, there's gonna be a sequel at this point because Netflix did way too well with it. Um,
I
with
agree, and I think
with
this would probably
with
bring us into transition of the villain characters.
with this though, I think they telegraphed that way too easily, right?
Which
Like
part?
the fact that the sequel arc was gonna be that Quinn actually had already escaped. Like
Ma-
Booker stumbling into the apartment and Quinn
Yeah,
being there, not a surprise whatsoever. Like I thought if there was an end credit scene, it was gonna
yeah,
be that because I figured if there was a sequel, they're gonna make this person who they've set up as someone who's gone mad, who is
right.
forgotten, and they mainly set her up as being the big baddie, and she could be the big baddie for the next two films if they did it right.
And
Because
I was expecting her to be the big bad. To be honest, I mean, I wasn't certain, but I thought probably better than a 50-50 shot. She was going to be a little even bit more involved in this first installment. I thought she might be kind of either the conclusion as the big baddie or a little bit more of a lead in on her getting out and maybe what that even means and whatever. So,
yeah, I thought they telegraphed that as soon as I saw like the end credit scene start and it was Booker. I'm like, oh, Quinn's gonna be in the apartment.
and
That's exactly what it's gonna be.
Quinn would have been a much more interesting villain than, as you and I have discussed, making that connection and knowing that Dudley Dursley was the villain in this film playing Merrick.
Only a
He's
lot
sort of
thinner.
a lot thinner, but also thinner figuratively as far as a villain, in my opinion. Sort of the
It was
evil for the sake of being evil villain. And
he was
he's a 30-year-old millennial that runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
a
Found
pharma.
interesting to me.
The idea was that the reason they're trying to capture him is because they're trying to unlock. The motivation behind that was fine. It was just it's a big pharma executive who wants to
It just
capture him
felt
to
too
make
on the
money.
nose.
Yeah, it was telegraphed, which is fine. If they do a second movie and Quinn is ultimately the big baddie for the next two films, I think it works because it was a throwaway baddie that they could use for an origin story, while setting up the backstory for who the real villain will actually be, right?
I
Now,
agree.
if they do a second film where Quinn ultimately redeems herself in the second film and is partnered up with them for the third film, and we have yet a
Yeah.
new baddie for the third film, then I'm gonna be kind of like tuned out at that point. But if Quinn is ultimately the big baddie for the next two films, I'm good. You gave me a throwaway. I understood the motivation. I understood where he was coming from. It was
Right.
all pure greed. I get it, right? And to a certain extent, maybe that's their political statement for this particular film: is big pharma only cares about profits.
I know, and that's the thing that bothered me. Honestly, it was like you got this kid. Let's just say, right?
Wait,
He
you can't have a
builds an
political statement in a sci-fi fantasy story like The Last Jedi and about weapons
I
manufacturing?
know. It's like they wanted the next like Martin Shkreli, but what would happen if he actually like didn't like jack off to Wu-Tang Records? Like what if he actually built an empire? It was just like it was like he's 30 and he somehow has like heavily trained guards and scientists, and I assumed Quinn would be the villain, and
I
in
thought they
theory
set him
she
up as
is.
someone who inherited it or something like that. I didn't think he was like the
Maybe
startup
they
of it.
did. Maybe I missed that, but it's like Quinn should be the villain. She ultimately will be. It seems like. I think it's a lot of I mentioned early on the X-Men parallels. Like much like Magneto, she's kind of seen the worst in humanity, and she'll be determined to really operate with like complete
And she's got a
disregard.
grudge. She's got a
Right, and
grudge
I don't
now.
blame her. Right,
Right.
that's interesting to me. That's a good character. I can't imagine 500 years of repetitive drowning, assuming that even happened. I'll get to that in a second. And I think that makes for a very interesting origin story for a villain. Instead, in this first film, if this becomes a standalone film, it's going to be a nightmare because the villain to me is just this sort of like petulant millennial, a millennial that like predictably puts profits over morals. It's like, okay, I could even accept that as like on paper if the character was more interesting. I think
Had
the
this been a
performance was
had
fine. It
this
just didn't have a
been
lot to work with.
had this been a big budget like theater movie, I think it would have been about 20 plus minutes longer, and then I think they could have developed the characters more and ultimately brought Quinn in as the big baddie a little bit by the end. But I think it being a direct to streaming, Netflix not sure how their reception's going to go. I think, and they played it safe. I think I think the sequel is definitely set up to be much stronger than the first act. You know, the second act could absolutely be that movie that does better than the first, right? Kind of like if you're going to draw that parallel of Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back is stronger than A New Hope, because it gets to build on what basically A New Hope did. The second movie on this can build on that. It can dive into the lore a hell of a lot more than it did this time. You can really dive into the villain and their motivation a whole lot more. I think it works. You know, A New Hope had your big baddie as the leader of the Death Star and not really Vader, even though Vader ultimately ends up being kind of, you know, who you actually follow. I think I hope they don't set up yet another baddie that is pulling Quinn's
just delaying
strings.
the inevitable. Yeah.
Right. I don't want an Emperor
unless
character
it's an interesting
show up.
one. I don't care, but make it interesting to me.
Right.
Like
I don't want an Emperor character, right? I want Quinn to be this is the bad guy, right?
I don't know if, and I know you don't play your like quite as many video games as I do in terms of like your kind of mainstream like military first person shooter, this sort of thing. So this I'm prefacing this because this is the best way I could describe how I felt some of this dialogue and the actual like scenes going on between characters. It felt like the actual writing felt like the level of quality that you would see in a cutscene in one of those games, if that makes any sense to anyone.
Yeah, I think the dialogue is weak, and but I've had this problem with movies for a long time. I think Hollywood has gotten so into the special effects and the situations that dialogue has gotten weak. Where like if you go back and like most movies that are quoted are like mid 90s or earlier, right? We don't make as many quotable movies anymore, and I think
we do quote a lot of television.
Dialogue writing, like some television comes up with some great quotes. Like you can pick out a whole bunch of great quotes out of Game of Thrones and stuff like that. So it feels like they care more about dialogue writing in TV than they do movies. Movies, we care about the spectacle of it all, and I want to get back
particularly your big budget films, right? I mean, because to be fair, I mean you've got like your Aaron Sorkins and people out there that are going to write something more like they would as a playwright, where they actually focus on that dialogue and it be the central part of the actual story. But
you figure Aaron Sorkin got his start in the early to mid 90s when dialogue writing was, that was important, was to have good dialogue that was good to listen to, good ear candy, Yeah. And I think we've really gotten away from that. And I feel like movies like this, movies like this, it really shows. And I really would like us to get back to it. And I think to a certain extent, part of the reason why is you really rarely have like a single writer on movies anymore, right? It is not the writer wrote a script and this is what we're going to follow. It's now we have a group of writers who all come together and they write this. And so there's never one voice a lot of times in movies nowadays. And I feel like to a certain extent, there was probably one guy who wrote the concept for this, which I know as far as the initial treatment for this film. And then they brought in a bunch of people to just kind of punch in some dialogue on it. Like I wrote the draft.
For what it's worth, I looked this up. This guy, Greg Rucka, that wrote it. I mean, I don't want to get too deep into this, but he wrote 18 episodes of Stumptown, which I actually heard was pretty good. I haven't watched it, but he wrote one episode of Young Justice. He wrote Wonder Woman Bloodlines, the graphic novel Whiteout, which I know they were working on. I think a movie they made a movie on with was that Jennifer Connelly? They made a movie out of that. Batman, Gotham Knight, and Siphon Filter, Logan's Shadow, which is a video game. It's a side scroller. I've played that. And this is what I mean. Like,
well, he's coming from a little bit of he's coming from a little bit of the animated realm of things, and to a certain extent, animated comic book. And since this is, so I understand a little bit of bringing that in, but none of those things also at the same time had great dialogue to them either, right?
And honestly, the dialogue could have been completely bland. I'd go back to make me care more about these characters. I know they can kind of be one and the same, but make the characters at least quirky, something unique about it that makes me continue to want to come back. And the
second chapter, I got to feel more from Andy. I need it. And at this point, I feel like the second chapter will be interesting to a certain extent because they've set Andy up as someone who's not immortal anymore, right?
Yeah, I wonder how that's going to play out. It's interesting. Now all of a sudden that she's got some actual stakes. Like, how does her character change?
Unless they dive into this lore and somehow she starts
Right.
to slowly get some of it back or something. Who
Yeah.
knows? Maybe
Yeah, they
it's
could.
the presence of a big baddie that will start to make her start to revamp itself. Who knows? We don't really
Yeah.
know the back and the lore, so who knows?
I want to. I wanted to add one other
I
thing,
was
and
gonna
this
say
is really
let's get
my
close
last
to
issue.
final thoughts.
I want to add, because this is a major issue. I almost would have led with this if I had really thought about it, but we started to agree on a lot of things. And you may disagree with me. If you do, I might know why, but we'll see. I don't want to call it out too early. Can we talk about the soundtrack briefly? It was distracting. I might even go as far to say it was awful. I feel very comfortable saying that. You have these great action sequences, and they're accompanied by what I would just describe as electro pop, complete with lyrics. So
Well,
like there's these climactic moments, and I've got someone softly singing over electro pop music. I felt like I was watching like a CW promo, not a CW show, a CW promo for a show during an actual fight scene, and that irritated me. It felt so, because we're talking, to me it would have worked better if you actually had timeless music. And what I mean by that is maybe, first of all, one, something without lyrics, whether that was an original score or just use old classical music, something that is going to tie in with the history of these people living for 500 plus years.
yeah, I think music helps bring weight to movies. I think you see that so often with so many movies where the soundtrack and the music that's specifically selected can elevate a movie, where the dialogue and the writing may have been weak. If that music helps bring that emotional impact up, you feel more about those scenes than you did when the music isn't good, right? Like,
Did it bother you?
I'll give you a prime example, right? The 80s Flash Gordon movie, very campy, but part of what makes that movie so great is the Queen music in it, right?
Sure. It's like
it
Guardians of the Galaxy leaning into that kind of soundtrack.
Right. It with that music, it really elevates it, and so many of the scenes itself. It brings weight in so many of the scenes that without it would have looked like some sort of parody type of movie without that music. And
Fine.
I think this movie was one of those things where if you and even going to another Queen example of the first Highlander movie. The first Highlander movie, the dialogue in that, especially Christopher Lambert's dialogue in most of that movie is not great, and he wasn't really good at English at that time when he did that movie. So, the music, the Queen music in that really helped to elevate, and the scores at the other moments really helped to elevate that movie a lot. And I think this needed that, and it didn't have it.
You're saying that it needed the equivalent of licensed music or music that was performed specifically for this movie. Like, I'm talking about, like, I feel like it needed a score, like not a.
Well,
I don't
and
want to feel like I'm listening to a bad Spotify playlist on shuffle
both
watching it.
But at the same time, both Flash and Highlander had scores in them. So you can mix and match it because it's still set modern times. So you could have added some modern music in it with a score.
Sure.
Just
I
like
mean, I would think of like maybe The Matrix was something like this to a certain degree.
And at the time, the Highlander movie, that was brand new music from Queen. So it was modern music, but it also had an underlying theatrical score with it as well. So you had both in those type of situations, and I think it would have benefited to have that here as well. So I do agree it should have had a little bit of its own original score in there. And who knows? Maybe they'll do better. Again, I don't know. Maybe it was a budget thing. The other problem you sometimes have with movies is what they end up doing is they end up, when they initially cut the movies, they throw in some filler music, and ultimately they might get attached to whatever that filler music is. And so they end up going out and just randomly finding music that kind of fits with that whatever filler music they put in, because that's what they cut it to. And I wouldn't be surprised if they just said, we're just going to go with the filler music in this case.
I wouldn't even describe that as filler music though. Like, to me, that's like, you find the karaoke version of those songs. At best, that's the filler music. Like, it was the vocals. It could have been they got the music drove me nuts.
They could have got the music really cheap. Again, that could have been how they kept the budget down a little bit with this movie, was because let's face it, all the blood and violence in it was all CG, and most of that was not practical effects. especially since they had to show them healing. So maybe that was way they cut the budget down, was they skimped and saved on the music part of it.
Maybe. I mean, my 6-year-old could just slam his elbows on a synthesizer and it might have been as effective, and it would have been very cheap.
All right. So any final thoughts besides that?
No, look, I mean, look, this movie was fine. It's something, if you enjoy action, if you're trying to watch a good summer kind of flick, this will probably scratch that itch. But be warned, in my opinion, that this is something that is setting up for what appears to maybe have a lot more promise than what the actual first film delivered. It's solid, right? I think I don't want to be attached to a specific score, but I do want to kind of say, like, it's, maybe a 6, 7 at best out of 10. Like, it's that kind of range, in my opinion.
I think a second movie can definitely help strengthen this movie as far as the overall perception. If it doesn't get a sequel, then it's going to become a forgettable streaming movie. I think part of the reason it did so well is probably because there's not a lot of options while we have a pandemic going on. But I think it's got promise, and I'd like to see that promise go somewhere in sequels. And it really, and some of what they at least laid the groundwork for in this movie pay off in the long run.
Let's hope that's the case, and it's not like another jumper.
If nothing else, it's a fun popcorn movie. I mean, just, microwave a bag of popcorn, sit there and, and eat it while you watch it. Don't think too hard into things. It's at least a fun movie. It leans heavily on the idea that you're going to watch it because of the main actor.
Coronavirus?
But I think some of the other actors gave better performance than the lead actress. So,
look, you don't have many options out there, people, if you're really hitting those movies hard. So no, it's fine. I agree. I think you're going to want to be on the ground floor if this thing actually gets better. And it sounds like a terrible endorsement, but I will agree that you're going to have a fun time if you like these sorts of films. And it does establish a pretty interesting premise, in my opinion. I just wish it would have gotten somewhere a little better in a shorter amount of time, but here we are.
With that being said, if you like this film or like this review, go ahead and like and subscribe to our channel. And as well as, if you really want to know when our next video will be out, go ahead and hit that notification button. So go ahead and check out our other videos, and we'll see you next time here on It Takes Two Takes.